Hi, I'm Reed Peterson and welcome to Grief Refuge. So here at Grief Refuge, we make time to honor your grief. In this sacred time together, it's also a sacred space to feel into your heart and to heal. It's safe to explore the deeper understandings of why grief hurts and what to do in order to heal. There are many grief-related podcasts available to listen to. I greatly appreciate that you're here with me today. I want to point out that Grief Refuge is very different from all the others. It goes quite a bit deeper. There will be ways for how to hold space for grief and how to make your life more enjoyable again. Grief Refuge is a guide for managing grief. I am very grateful that you're here with me today. I look forward to helping in whatever way I can, hoping that you feel more comforted, supported, and more informed about the ways to cope and heal. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to stop multitasking while you're listening. Instead of trying to get so many things done, rather just use this time for your self-care and for your reflection. Use this time to relax and to allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. This is a safe space. You can use this time to mourn your loss. The topic for today, I think, is very familiar and very common to pretty much every adult individual experiencing grief. It's about grief-related regret. We all experience regrets at some point in life. And what I've found is grief, it really brings up a lot of regrets. So, enjoy, and I mean that in the sense of I hope you receive value from what's about to be shared, and I'll get started. One of the more common words I hear from people impacted by grief is the word regret. I'm told that they have many regrets. Some are for behaviors when their special person was still living. Some are for thoughts that they continue to have, despite knowing they couldn't have done anything differently. And some are for words that were or were not spoken to their special person when they were still living. Regret hurts. It hurts emotionally, and it hurts psychologically. Regret has been known to keep people from working through their grief. It can keep someone stuck in the past, getting lost in thought about what should have been different. I'm currently supporting a griever who is really struggling with his regret. For the protection of his privacy, I'm going to call him Tony. Tony lost his husband to cancer. His husband battled it for 5 years. Tony tells me that during his husband's illness, there were times that were good, times that were bad, and times that were ugly. But one of the things that is really hurting Tony right now is that he has regrets, and he's put himself on the hook for them. When Tony's husband was ill, he spent time at home, resting and watching TV. Tony would spend time with him, watching programs together and feeling this sense of connection and quality time. But Tony went through a phase where he avoided his husband. He intentionally did other things to distract himself, and at that time, he drank. Now that his husband is no longer living, Tony replays the memories of when his husband used to tell him that he was lonely and that he needed Tony to spend more time with him. Tony regrets the drinking and what he had to do to distract himself. Tony put himself on the hook for not being as available as what his husband needed him to be. Tony spends a lot of time with these thoughts of regret. He hopes that one day the pain will lessen or even go away. I find Tony's experience pretty common. Many people in grief want to go from regret to being okay with what is real. And for many, no matter how many times you tell yourself what's really real, the mind continues to play memories that make you think you should have done something differently. Here's a tricky fact about regret. You can regret doing something as much as you can regret having done nothing at all. Regret makes you feel like you're damned that you did, or you're damned if you didn't. Grief-related regret tends to be focused on the past. It's about wanting or wishing something that happened to now be different. It may be so because the decision created painful consequences or the behavior led to unfavorable results. For whatever reason, it's easy to think that in life, mistakes can be fixed. You messed up once and you won't do it again. But after the death of a loved one, it's easy to believe that nothing can be changed. What happened was wrong, and it may be that way forever. And it's now time to pay the consequences. Death is permanent, it can't be changed, and this fact often gets tied into regret, causing you to believe that because you feel a certain way about things that happened in the past, you're going to always feel that way, now and in the future. That type of association, it's a big contributor to why regret feels so painful in grief. When my stepfather died, my mom administered CPR for several minutes before the paramedics arrived. My mom knew how to do CPR. She was an RN for more than 20 years. But she just couldn't save Warren. And she regretted it for a long time. The regret initially caused her a lot of pain in her grief, but now she's doing better. What's different now is that she knows she did the best she could to try to save him. She also knows that the regret-related thoughts in her early grief are just not as true as what they felt or first seemed to be. Why did she have such regretful thoughts if they were never true? Most people want to understand their grief. They want to make sense of something so painful and unbearable. If they understand it, maybe it won't hurt as bad. I believe that regretful thoughts sometimes happen because your heart misses that connection, and then your mind looks for substitute solutions. I think this happens on an unconscious level, and there's very little awareness when it actually is happening. Awareness is really important, but the awareness comes later after the regret feels more familiar and more common. I would say that the awareness comes in the aftermath of grief. By the time awareness shows up, the mind, it's convinced that something that was never real actually should be real, and it should have happened. I think this is why my mom regretted not saving Warren's life. She unconsciously convinced herself that it was possible, and she should have saved him. But after working through her grief, she accepted that it wasn't nearly as possible as what she originally thought. For grief-related regret, the consequence is feeling more shame and punishing yourself for such a devastating loss. As a grief companion, it's hard to witness this. And to be honest, there's a big part of me that really wants to try to fix this or stop someone from being really hard and hurtful to themselves. But that's not really my job. And for many, this regret and this pain it's part of the grief journey. The regret may be necessary to work through. It may play a significant part in someone's healing. I really wish that I could explain why, or that I could help you predict if regret is necessary in your own grief, but I just can't. I guess that if I were to have a superhuman power, that would probably be it. So if you're wishing that your grief-related regret would just go away, here's what I would say. I would say, it's here. It feels real right now. And there's something important that may come from it. Instead of wanting it to go away, can you give it some space and listen to what it's trying to tell you? There are some common ways regret can show up in someone's life. Karen Arnold over at Grief in Common provided a great summary for many of these ways. I'm going to highlight just a few, but to find the full list, you can search regret on the Grief in Common website. Here's what some of Karen wrote. Grief-related regret is common for people who feel they took many things for granted with the person who died. They run through memories, judging themselves for not being as present, being moody, emotionally unavailable, etc. They then punish themselves with thoughts of negativity or even self-hatred, thus causing the pain to feel more intense. For a loss that feels traumatic, people often judge themselves for not being able to do more. They regret not trying harder to get someone help for some type of addiction. They struggle with regret because, in hindsight, they had more control over the actions, or lack of, in helping, trying harder, getting help, etc. Grief-related regret can be something left unsaid, or a decision made near the end that they wish they could change, or a situation unresolved. After a loss, these regrets can haunt us endlessly. Thank you very much for that insight, Karen. At this point, I want to shift gears a bit. I've shared about what grief-related regret is and how it may be seen or felt. Let's now explore what regret does to a person who is grieving. This was mentioned a little bit earlier, but sadly, regret can cause someone to feel a lot of shame. Putting yourself on the hook for something related to your loss can convince you that you've done a very bad thing. If you were to stay in that mind frame, that's more known as guilt. But if you were to start identifying yourself as somebody who's done wrong, somebody who's bad, that's shame. Some examples of shame and grief are, I was a terrible husband. I deserve this suffering, or he died because of me. I witness a lot of people being really hard on themselves in their grief. And unfortunately, I frequently hear many grievers shame themselves. I'll be sure to create another podcast episode on shame and guilt, but I did want to mention it here as part of what regret can become if unmanaged or not worked through. Grief-related regret can also lead to a deeper sense of sadness. It's okay to feel sad and grief, but too much of it can lead to depression. The difference between grief and depression is an important topic, and yes, that will be another podcast episode, but let me just say one thing about the difference here. If you're grieving and wondering if you're depressed, check in with yourself about your feelings of self-worth. If your self-esteem feels very low, you may want to reach out to a mental health professional for help. Grief-related regret has also been known to make people very anxious. Repeated thoughts with the perception of a different choice keeps you in your head, wishing for a different outcome. Anxiety and grief is common. The mind does imagine things that are painful after a loss. There's a good book called Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief, written by Claire Bidwell Smith. That could be a good read if you know that you're feeling a lot of anxiety in your grief right now. The last thing I'll mention about what grief-related regret can do to you is that it can create a bias in decision-making going forward. The bias is tough because it's a bias towards making poor choices. If you hang on to regrets and your grief for too long, you can set yourself up for future disappointments and painful outcomes. Your mind may keep punishing yourself, tricking you into these types of decisions. That's a vicious cycle to be in. It's hard when you're making choices that punish yourself without being fully aware of them. Grief-related regret may be a part of what influences these choices and decisions. Here's a brief story from a griever who hung on to regret and how it made his life more difficult. Dave says, "My father passed away 3 years ago. We had our ups and downs, but in his last year I couldn't talk to him. His meds made him a terror to be around. He got really mean and threatening. I got so angry at him, I told him to go choke on his pills, and that we're better off without him. The problem is that a couple weeks after my outburst, he died. I felt awful that he died and that I had said such angry things. I thought a million times about apologizing, but I never did. Now, I regret not telling him I was sorry. I wanted to tell him that I never meant what I said. My anger got the best of me, and my father died thinking that I wanted him dead. That thought runs through my head every day. Instead of looking out for him, I acted out in anger. I know he wasn't trying to do wrong, but now I feel like I failed him. I don't know how to forgive myself." In Dave's story, he hung on to his regret long enough for it to cause problems for him. He ended up sabotaging himself and he got fired from his job. What happened for Dave was that he convinced himself he was an angry and a bad person. And then one day at work, his temper flared up and he was eventually let go. Grief-related regrets may lead to self-punishment and self-sabotage for what is most of the time false beliefs that you should have known better or there was another option at the time you were making the decision. You run the event over and over in your head, telling yourself you made the wrong choice. Your mind punishes you by telling you you have to pay the consequences now. You now have to suffer because of the poor choice you made. Too often we tend to take the thing we regret and then use it to label and define ourselves. Hanging on to the regret for too long will take you to a dark place and complicate your grief. So let's now explore what can be done to let go of or work through grief-related regret. Reframing what you tell yourself. To feel better about grief-related regret involving an action, you have to believe that you never made a bad choice. You made the best choice with all the information, the circumstances, and everything happening at the time. You have to let yourself off the hook and trust and believe that you did the best you could with what you had. Reframing will take time. It's a discipline because at first it may feel like your reframe isn't true. It may be hard to believe, so it will require a lot of repetition. It may be helpful to write it down and place it somewhere so that you can look at it throughout the day and repeat it as many times as possible. If you are familiar with using affirmations, this technique of reframing, it's very similar. Just keep at it and trust that the more you engage in this process, the more the feeling will hold. You'll reach a point where your regret won't hurt as much and you'll believe that you did do the best you could. Apologize. Many grievers I know apologize to their loved one. They say that they're sorry, internally and aloud. Many people use their voice to apologize. Many people write letters. Many people apologize in their thoughts. Any way you can say you're sorry is helpful. It helps you feel more into your emotions, giving them space to run their course. You may also benefit from apologizing over and over again. That's okay too. One recommendation for apologizing is to be very specific. Saying you're sorry for everything may be more harmful in your grief, but saying you're sorry for something specific, that can help better understand the bigger picture, help you reframe events, help you restore emotions for your healing, help put things into perspective, and even provide a permission to forgive yourself. So how do you forgive yourself? Forgiving yourself is a process. It's hard, and it requires a lot of patience. But I think that anyone experiencing grief-related regret is also going through the process of self-forgiveness, whether it's conscious or not. The process itself involves a shift in perspective, just enough to be kind, gentle, and compassionate to yourself. The process also involves finding or returning to a place of loving yourself. I know that that's also hard too, regardless of how you're grieving. There's a lot of models for forgiveness, for yourself and for others. These models tend to be complex, so forgiveness and grief will be broken down into another podcast episode in the future. But there are a couple things that are worth noting here. Forgiveness can be perceived as a feeling, but it's actually a choice. Semantically, when you say, I can't forgive myself, arguably, you're really saying, I won't forgive myself. That's a tough truth, and I know it's hard to hear, but it makes sense to feel this way when you're grieving. Grief is very complex, and the regret, it's an important piece to the healing process. If you have compassion for yourself, it helps with forgiveness. Another tip to forgive yourself is to repeat the facts. This may be more helpful if you write things down, but try to think of things that you did to love and care for your special person too. These facts will help you accept the reality of the bigger picture. Acceptance is also an important part to forgiveness. Acceptance is listed as one of the stages of grief, but it's also a decision you make when you are looking to forgive yourself. My hope is that you look at the facts, you apologize, and you decide to forgive yourself and let yourself off the hook. Over the years, I have had to forgive myself for some of my own grief-related regrets. My stepfather battled cancer for 8 years despite receiving his prognosis of 1 year to live. In those 8 years, there were countless visits to the hospital. What I regretted was that I lived so far away and that I was unable to do more than what I could. And after Warren died, I struggled with the memories of the times that we talked on the phone during his illness. When I replayed those memories in the conversations, I told myself I could have done more. I could have done a lot more than what I did. I also regretted not being a better listener to my mom. She was right there alongside him throughout his whole time battling his cancer. She went through a very immense process of anticipatory grief. And unfortunately, at the time, I wasn't as skilled as I am now in this grief companioning work. I would think about her grief and what she would say to me on the phone, and then I would tell myself I could have helped more by saying less, listening more, and being more empathetic. Over time, I worked through my regrets and felt a sense of healing by reframing a lot of my thoughts and revisiting the facts of my experience. I did live over 2,000 miles away. I did host several fundraiser events to help them pay for medical bills. I did call frequently and listen to the best of my ability. The more I replayed the facts of the greater experience and the reality that I did do the best I could, the more I forgave myself and didn't feel as much regret. It wasn't easy, and it was a process, but I did work through it, and I trust that you can too. To sum things up on this grief-related regret, we went over what it means, how it impacts your grief, and some of the things you can do to work through regret to let it go. Grief-related regret hurts, and I hope that you treat yourself with the kindness and the self-compassion as you work through it all. If you're in a place of needing extra support, please reach out at griefrefuge.com. I would be honored to help in whatever way I can. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It is such an honor to hold space for your grief and for your healing. It is such an honor to help share this information as education. Grief is pretty darn complex, so I hope this helps. If you found this to be helpful, please let us know. You can rate and review the podcast, or you can even message us through griefrefuge.com. That's all for today. Thank you so much. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.